What if zero never reached Europe? The idea sounds almost ridiculous, yet it sits inside a quiet hinge of history. The decimal system, the simplest and most powerful tool for modern science, rests on a placeholder, a nothing that suddenly becomes everything. If Europe never fully embraced that nothingness, the arithmetic skeleton of every invention would look different. The counting boards would fill with tallies and memory, and the world would learn to trust estimation over exactness long after the rest of the world had moved on. The consequences would seep through every corridor of power, from markets to monasteries, from ships at sea to the chalk lines of astronomers. This is not a fantasy about grand battles, but a small rethink of how we measure the world and how that measurement reshapes our choices in the long arc of time. When you can represent nothing, you unlock the ability to show balance, debts, gains, and losses in a single stroke. Without that nothingness, nations would rely on heavier words for consequence. A ledger filled with markers of absence rather than a clean zero. Balances would require clever ruses and ritual arithmetic to keep track of growth and collapse. Markets would feel heavier, more uncertain, because numbers would not sit evenly on counting scales. Instead, traders would design complex notations using context and memory. A kind of accounting poetry where a plus sign is a story and a dash is a rumor. The very act of representing nothing would become a craft passed down in guilds and coffee houses, not in universities and observatories. From this one absence, the shape of commerce would shift. The speed of exchange would slow as people negotiated trust. Not just price. The idea of a precise interest rate would be replaced by careful talk about risk and reputation. A bookkeeper would not simply balance columns, but coax meaning from empty spaces and margins. The line between numbers and words would blur. Then came the sciences. Without a grant worthy of daily weathering, scientists would still measure the heavens, but their tools would not sing with the same clarity. A calendar would drift with the moon. A day share of time would depend on ritual cycles rather than computed leap days, and the rhythm of cities would drift. The map would grow stubborn to precision sails, would plot courses with rough beliefs rather than exact quantities. The library of nature would still exist, but its catalog would be a cousin to poetry and memory, rather than a science prized for its calculus amid the stars. The effect would push astronomy into a different cadence. The movement of planets would be described with lore observation and geometry that favors qualitative sense over numeric certainty. You would hear the word variably instead of verifiably, and you would learn to trust patterns rather than proofs. This is not merely a mismatch of tools. It is a shift in how people think about certainty and how communities decide what to build around it. In such a world, technology would still arrive, but it would arrive with different preconditions. The industrial era would require clever workarounds, a different economy of risk, and an education that prizes analog intuition as much as mathematical abstraction. The steam engine would still advance, but the gears would be tuned by narrative reliability, not by formulaic computation. The engineer would speak in terms of prototypes and trial runs rather than in equations and diagrams. The moral imagination of policymakers would also change. They would test ideas in public and measure impact through crowdsourced feedback, rather than through models with zero as a central character. The political life of power would bend toward different rituals of accountability. In a time when nothing is a thing without ceremony, the most visible outcomes would be in fashion and currency. The color of money would glow with textures and materials rather than glow with numeric digits. A coin might tell a story of a nation, a moment in trade, a promise held by merchants who barter not just goods, but trust. The idea of debt would be a social contract, a ritual marker of obligation carried by words and warrants. Rather than the crisp tally of a ledger's digits would be scarce, and meaning would live in the language of exchange. The world would still invent and improvise, but the style of invention would be street-side and workshop-led rather than university-led. It is a quiet counterfactual, a reminder that history does not always hinge on mighty battles, but on the invisible scaffolding that holds knowledge together. The absence of a single symbol reshapes the entire architecture of culture and science. So we imagine not a world without invention, but a world where nothingness is a partner to invention, A reminder that every brilliant leap rests on a tiny blank space where we dare to fill in with meaning. In the end, this thought experiment touches a simple human truth that the smallest idea can tilt a universe. We invent because we need to see the world with greater clarity. And in this alternate chain of events, the clarity comes not from the absence of error, but from the acceptance of absence itself. And that changes the way we look at progress, the way we teach our children, the way we imagine the future. The twist lingers and unsettles because it asks you to rethink what counts as progress and who gets to decide. It makes you notice the quiet hinges in everyday life, the moments when we assume nothing can be exact, and still we choose to move forward with faith in possibility rather than certainty. This is the kind of history that lives in the margins of a lesson, a thought experiment that sits at the edge of a screen waiting for your next question to turn a tiny historical hinge into a new way of looking at the world.